the porcelain doll. In the cobblestone streets of Bath, England, there lived a young woman named Margaret Ashford. She worked as a restoration artist at the city's most prestigious antique gallery, spending her days breathing life back into forgotten treasures. Her partner, Thomas Bennett, was a museum curator, a man of logic and science, deeply skeptical of anything he couldn't explain. Their modest Victorian townhouse was filled with beautiful objects from different eras. Margaret collected them obsessively, each piece telling a story of someone's past. Thomas tolerated her hobby with gentle humor, though he often warned her that not everything deserved to be saved. It was on a gray October afternoon when Margaret found it. She'd been attending an estate sale in the Cotswolds, sifting through boxes of items from a manor house that had been shuttered for decades. Most were worthless: chipped teacups, yellowed lace, broken furniture. But in a locked chest at the very bottom, wrapped in ancient newspaper, was a doll. Not a child's toy, but something far more unsettling. It was porcelain, exquisitely crafted, standing about 18 inches tall. Its face was painted with delicate precision: pale skin, rosy cheeks, eyes that seemed to follow you. It wore a Victorian dress of cream silk, stained and faded with age. The tag attached to its wrist read, "Cordelia, 1887. Return her, or face eternal sorrow." Margaret should have left it there. Every instinct told her to. But the artist in her saw only a masterpiece in need of care. A beautiful thing abandoned and forgotten. She bought it for £3. Thomas was not pleased. "Why would you buy something with such a morbid tag?" he asked, examining the doll with visible discomfort. "Some things are better left in the past, Margaret." She dismissed his concerns. "It's just a doll. Someone's beloved possession, now lost and alone, just like all the other treasures here." That night, she placed Cordelia on the mantelpiece in their sitting room, angled so the doll seemed to gaze across the room. Margaret spent hours researching its origins, but found nothing. No records, no artist's signature, no history. It was as though Cordelia had simply materialized, untethered from time. 3 days later, things began to change. Margaret woke one morning to find the doll had moved. It now sat on the edge of the sofa facing the bedroom door. She knew, absolutely knew, that she'd left it on the mantelpiece. Thomas swore he hadn't touched it. "Old wood settles," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Things shift, but they both knew better. That night, Margaret heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from the sitting room. She crept downstairs, Thomas close behind her, and found the doll exactly where it had been that morning, on the mantelpiece. Yet the sound continued, coming from inside the walls. By the end of the week, Margaret had begun to notice other things. Her dreams had become vivid and terrible. She found herself in a dark, Victorian nursery, watching a small girl being locked away, crying for her mother. She'd wake gasping, her heart racing. Thomas would hold her, reassuring her it was only a nightmare. But the nightmares grew worse each night, and Cordelia watched from the mantelpiece, her painted eyes seeming to track Margaret's every movement. By the second week, Margaret couldn't deny that something was deeply wrong. The doll had moved again, this time to the foot of their bed. She'd locked the bedroom door that night, Yet somehow Cordelia had appeared there, sitting upright, her arms positioned as though reaching toward the pillow where Margaret slept. Thomas insisted on moving the doll to the attic, but when Margaret went to retrieve something that afternoon, she found it back downstairs, positioned on the kitchen table, facing the chair where she always sat for breakfast. "This is madness," Thomas said, his rational worldview visibly cracking. "Dolls don't move on their own. There's a logical explanation." "Then explain it," Margaret demanded, her voice breaking.
Explain any of this.
He couldn't. Margaret began to research the doll's history more desperately. She visited libraries, consulted occult historians, even spoke with an elderly antiques dealer named Mrs. Eleanor Finch, who had dealt in rare items for 50 years. When Margaret showed her a photograph of Cordelia, the old woman's face went ashen. "Where did you get this?" Mrs. Finch whispered, gripping Margaret's arm. "From an estate sale in the Cotswolds." "Why, do you know something about it?" Mrs. Finch led her to a back room of the shop and pulled out an old leather journal. Inside were sketches and newspaper clippings dating back to the Victorian era. One article, yellowed and fragile, bore the headline, "Child dies under mysterious circumstances at Blackthorn Manor." The article described the death of a young girl named Cordelia Ashworth, just 8 years old. In 1889, she had been locked in the nursery by her governess as punishment for misbehavior. When the governess returned hours later, Cordelia was found dead, her body cold, her eyes wide open in terror. The cause was never determined. Some whispered of a broken heart. Others spoke of something darker, that the child's rage and despair had manifested into something that fed on her final moments. After her death, Mrs. Finch continued reading from the journal. A porcelain doll was commissioned by her mother, made to look exactly like Cordelia. It was meant to preserve her memory, but those who owned it reported disturbances, nightmares. The doll moving of its own accord. People in the household became ill. Some lost their minds. Eventually, the doll disappeared from record around 1920. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Until now. That evening, she found something carved into the wooden frame of the dolls, a chair, letters scratched so deeply they'd gouged the wood. "Let me out." The handwriting was childlike, desperate. Thomas wanted to throw the doll away, burn it, destroy it completely. But Margaret found herself unable to do it. Every time she tried to touch Cordelia, a wave of such profound sorrow washed over her that she'd collapse, tears streaming down her face. Not her own tears, she felt certain, but someone else's grief channeling through her. That night, Margaret had the most vivid nightmare yet. She stood in a Victorian nursery, watching a small girl with dark hair pound against a locked door, screaming for her mother. The girl's face was contorted with rage and despair, and as Margaret watched, the child turned to look directly at her and spoke in a voice like breaking glass. "You brought me back. Now you must finish what was started." Margaret woke to find Cordelia standing on her chest, staring down at her in the darkness. She screamed. Thomas rushed in, turned on the light, and found Margaret alone in bed, shaking violently. There was no doll, but when they searched the house, they found Cordelia in the kitchen, positioned at the table once more, as if waiting for breakfast. Margaret knew then that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. The nightmares intensified. Every night, Margaret found herself back in that locked nursery, experiencing Cordelia's final hours through her own consciousness. She felt the girl's desperation, her rage, her absolute conviction that no one was coming to save her. And she felt the moment when something inside Cordelia shattered. Not her body, but her spirit, fragmenting into pieces that clung to the last thing that had ever loved her, the porcelain doll made in her image. Margaret began to deteriorate. She lost weight, stopped sleeping properly, developed dark circles under her eyes. Her work suffered. Thomas urged her to see a doctor, but Margaret refused. She knew no doctor could help her. This wasn't a medical condition. This was a haunting. She spent her days researching Cordelia Ashworth, piecing together the girl's tragic history. Born in 1881 to wealthy parents at Blackthorn Manor in Gloucestershire, Cordelia had been a lonely child. Her mother distant and cold, her father absent. She'd been raised primarily by servants, educated by a strict governess named Miss Helena Crane. The governess was brutal, using isolation and deprivation as punishment for even minor infractions. On the day of her death, 6-year-old Cordelia had spilled ink on the governess's correspondence. As punishment, she was locked in the nursery without food or water, told she would remain there until she learned obedience. The governess, it seemed, had forgotten about her, or perhaps deliberately abandoned the child. By evening, Cordelia was found dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but the servants had whispered of something else. They'd heard the child screaming, pounding on the door, calling for her mother, and then a terrible silence. When they finally broke the door down, Cordelia lay on the floor, her eyes still open, staring at something they couldn't see. Within months of the child's death, her mother had commissioned the doll. She'd meant it as a memorial, a way to keep her daughter close, but something had gone terribly wrong. The doll had become a vessel, a prison for a child's unresolved rage and sorrow. Margaret found herself sympathizing with Cordelia in ways that frightened her. She understood the child's loneliness, her desperation, her fury at being abandoned and forgotten, and Cordelia somehow understood Margaret. One evening, Margaret discovered that she could communicate with the doll, not in words, but in feelings, in images. She would sit before Cordelia and sense the child's needs, her desires, her desperate hunger for acknowledgement and love. Cordelia wanted to be remembered. She wanted her story told. She wanted justice for what had been done to her. Thomas grew increasingly alarmed by his partner's behavior. "You're talking to a doll, Margaret. Do you hear yourself? This has to stop." "You don't understand," Margaret whispered. "She's been alone for so long. No one remembers her. No one cares. She's just forgotten." "Then let her stay forgotten," Thomas said, his voice hard. "I won't watch you destroy yourself for a ghost." That night, Thomas made a decision. He would take the doll and dispose of it, whatever it took. He wrapped Cordelia in a blanket and drove toward the river, intending to throw her in, to be done with it once and for all. But his car broke down 3 miles from their home. The engine simply died, wouldn't start again, and as he sat in the darkness, Thomas felt a terrible cold seep through the car. The rearview mirror began to frost over, and in the ice, a small handprint appeared, tiny, childlike, pressing from the inside of the glass. Thomas heard a child's voice, thin and hollow. "You can't leave me again." He abandoned the car and ran, leaving the doll behind. But Cordelia was waiting for him when he reached home, sitting in the kitchen, wrapped in her blanket, exactly as he'd left her in the vehicle. Thomas finally broke. He packed a bag and left, unable to bear it any longer. He told Margaret he couldn't stay, that he loved her, but he couldn't watch her be consumed by this thing. Margaret didn't try to stop him. She was no longer entirely Margaret anymore. She and Cordelia had become something else, intertwined, inseparable. Left alone with Cordelia, Margaret surrendered completely to the haunting. She stopped pretending to maintain her normal life. She called in sick to work, then simply never returned. She spent her days with the doll, talking to her, telling her stories, painting her delicate features with even more care, as though by perfecting the doll's appearance, she could somehow restore what had been lost. At night, the boundaries between Margaret and Cordelia began to dissolve. Margaret would wake with no memory of how she'd spent the previous hours, only to find that Cordelia had been moved, or the house had been rearranged, or new items appeared, toys from the Victorian era, children's clothing, items that Cordelia seemed to need. The nightmares became so vivid that Margaret could no longer distinguish them from reality. She existed in a perpetual state between waking and dreaming, between herself and the ghost child who shared her body, her mind, her very soul. She began to see Cordelia's full manifestation, not just the doll, but a transparent child-shaped shadow that moved through the house, always watching, always present. The girl looked exactly like her porcelain counterpart, dressed in the same Victorian clothing, her eyes hollow and ancient despite her young face. One evening there came a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the antiques dealer. She'd become concerned about Margaret, had driven to the house to check on her. What she found horrified her. Margaret had aged dramatically in just 3 weeks. Her hair had turned partially white. Her eyes held a distant, unfocused quality. The house had become a shrine to Cordelia, every surface covered with Victorian memorabilia, children's toys, old photographs, and at the center of it all sat the porcelain doll, surrounded by candles that had burned down to stubs. "Margaret, my God," Mrs. Finch whispered. "What's happened to you?" Margaret turned to face her, and for a moment, Mrs. Finch saw something deeply unsettling in her expression. It wasn't entirely Margaret looking back. It was as though 2 entities occupied the same space, the young woman's features flickering between her own self and something older, more desperate, more hungry. "She needed me," Margaret said, her voice layered with another voice beneath it, a child's voice, thin and reedy. "She needed someone to remember, someone to care. I'm all she has." Mrs. Finch tried to convince Margaret to leave the house to seek help. But Margaret refused. "I can't abandon her. Not like everyone else did. If I leave, she'll be alone again. And I can't bear that." Mrs. Finch realized with growing dread that Margaret was no longer entirely in control of herself. The entity that had once been trapped in the doll had found a new vessel, a living human consciousness that could think, feel, move, and act in the world in ways a porcelain doll never could. Cordelia had found her escape. Mrs. Finch left the house in a state of panic and contacted the local authorities. When the police arrived, they found Margaret sitting perfectly still in the sitting room, the doll on her lap, both of them staring at the door with identical expressions of accusation and sorrow. Margaret was taken to a psychiatric facility against her will. The doctors found nothing medically wrong with her. No tumors, no chemical imbalances, no physical cause for her deterioration. They diagnosed her with a dissociative disorder, prescribed medication, and tried to help her reintegrate with reality. But Margaret was no longer entirely there to reintegrate. She spent her days in the hospital sitting silently, sometimes whispering to someone no one else could see. When asked about the doll, she would become agitated, insisting that Cordelia was still at home, alone, frightened, waiting for her. The doctors increased her medication. Margaret grew quieter, more withdrawn, as though she were disappearing bit by bit. And in the house on the Bath Street corner, Cordelia waited. The doll sat on the mantelpiece gathering dust, but those who passed by swore they could see her eyes move, tracking their movements. At night, neighbors reported hearing a child crying, though no child lived there. And sometimes on very still evenings, they heard a woman's voice, Margaret's voice, singing lullabies in the darkness. 6 months after Margaret's hospitalization, strange events began occurring at the psychiatric facility. The staff reported hearing childish laughter in the corridors at night. Patients complained of a small figure standing at the foot of their beds. Most disturbingly, several long-term patients began exhibiting symptoms identical to Margaret's: dissociation, communication with invisible entities, expressions of profound sorrow and longing. It became clear that something had followed Margaret to the hospital, or perhaps something had left the house with her. Unable to bear separation from its new host, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, racked with guilt, decided she had to act. She returned to the house in Bath and retrieved Cordelia from the mantelpiece. This time she didn't hesitate. She took the doll to a Catholic priest, Father Michael Sullivan, and begged him to perform some kind of exorcism or blessing. Father Sullivan was a practical man, not given to dramatic gestures. But when he held the doll, he felt something that shook his faith in rationality. The porcelain was ice cold despite the warm room, and he sensed a presence, not evil, exactly, but desperate, hungry, impossibly sad. "This child suffered greatly," Father Sullivan said quietly, "and her suffering has attached itself to this object. It's looking for comfort, for love, for someone to acknowledge her pain. As long as it searches, it will consume anyone who comes near it." He performed a blessing, prayers for the dead, and a ritual of separation. He told Mrs. Finch that the only way to truly help Cordelia was to ensure her story was remembered, that her death was acknowledged, her suffering witnessed, her memory preserved. Mrs. Finch made it her mission. She published a detailed account of Cordelia Ashworth's life and death in a local historical journal. She commissioned a memorial plaque at Blackthorn Manor where the child had died. She visited Margaret regularly at the hospital, reading her the articles, telling her that Cordelia would finally be remembered. And slowly something changed. Margaret began to recover. Not completely. She would never be entirely the same woman she'd been before finding the doll. But she began to resurface. She spoke coherently again. She stopped whispering to empty air. The other patients at the hospital seemed to improve as well. The last night in the hospital, Margaret had a dream. She found herself in that Victorian nursery one final time. But this time Cordelia wasn't screaming or raging. The child sat peacefully surrounded by light and she was smiling. "You remembered me," Cordelia whispered. "You told my story. Now I can rest." When Margaret woke, she felt lighter than she had in months. The connection to Cordelia had loosened, like a rope finally released from her chest. As for the doll, Father Sullivan took possession of it. He kept it locked in a wooden box in the church basement, blessed monthly, tended with prayers and intentions of peace. And if the doll ever moves on its own, if it ever appears in places it shouldn't be, Father Sullivan doesn't speak of it. Some things he's learned are better left undisturbed, monitored from a safe distance. Margaret was eventually released from the hospital. She never returned to her antique gallery work. Instead, she became a historical researcher, dedicating herself to uncovering the stories of forgotten Victorian children who had died in tragedy and obscurity. She wrote a book about Cordelia Ashworth that was published to moderate success, ensuring that the child's name would live on in historical records. And on quiet evenings, Margaret sometimes sits alone in her apartment and feels a presence. Not frightening anymore, but peaceful. A warmth, a gratitude, the sense of a small hand briefly touching hers before fading away. She hopes that somewhere Cordelia is finally, but occasionally late at night, Margaret dreams of that nursery again. And sometimes she sees new faces there, other children, other forgotten souls looking at her with desperate, hopeful eyes waiting to be remembered. She wonders how many more stories she'll have to tell before they all find peace. And in the church basement, wrapped in blessed cloth and locked away from the world, Cordelia waits, patient, eternal, neither fully trapped nor fully free. Some hauntings, it seems, can never truly end. They can only be transformed, redirected, held in careful balance between the living world and whatever lies beyond. 3 years after Margaret's release from the hospital, something unexpected happened. A young girl named Sophie arrived at St. Michael's Church, brought by social services. She was 8 years old and the same age Cordelia had been when she died, and she'd been removed from an abusive home where she'd suffered years of neglect and isolation. She was withdrawn, traumatized, barely able to speak. Father Sullivan began working with Sophie, trying to help her process her trauma through art and storytelling. One day, while searching for materials in the church basement, Sophie discovered the locked wooden box containing Cordelia's doll. When Father Sullivan found her, Sophie was sitting on the cold stone floor, staring at the box with an expression of profound recognition. "There's someone in there," she whispered. "A girl. She's been lonely for such a long time." Father Sullivan's heart sank. He knew what was happening. He took the box away and contacted Margaret immediately. When Margaret arrived at the church, she felt it too, a sudden shift in the air, a presence that had been dormant stirring back to life. Cordelia had sensed a kindred spirit, another abandoned child, another small soul crying out in darkness. Margaret spent the afternoon with Sophie, not as a counselor or adult figure, but simply as someone who understood loss. She told Sophie about Cordelia, not as a ghost or a warning, but as a girl who had suffered, whose pain had been real and valid, and whose memory now mattered because people cared enough to remember her. Sophie listened intently, and by the end of the afternoon, something had shifted in the child's eyes. She was no longer afraid of the presence in the church. Instead, she spoke to it with understanding. "You're not alone anymore. No one is forgotten here. I'm not forgotten. And neither are you." That night, Father Sullivan reported that he felt the presence in the basement change. It became lighter, less desperate, almost peaceful. And when he opened the box to check on the doll, he found something astonishing. Cordelia's painted face seemed different. For the first time in over a century, the porcelain doll was smiling. Sophie remained at the church, eventually being fostered by a kind family in the parish. She visited regularly, and she developed a strange but beautiful friendship with Cordelia's doll. She would sit beside the locked box and talk to the doll, sharing her own fears and hopes. And gradually, as Sophie healed from her own trauma, she felt Cordelia's presence fade, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something gentler, more like a guardian spirit than a desperate ghost. Margaret watched this transformation with wonder and sadness. She understood that Cordelia had finally found what she'd always needed. Not to haunt, not to possess, but to connect with another lost child and help her understand that her pain was witnessed, that her suffering mattered, that she was never truly alone. 2 years later, on a gray October afternoon, and exactly 11 years after Margaret had first purchased the doll, Sophie came to the church with a project. She'd written a children's book about Cordelia Ashworth, illustrated with beautiful watercolors. It was a story of a lonely girl, a tragic loss, and ultimately, of remembrance and healing. The book was published, and slowly, Cordelia Ashworth's story spread. School children read about her. History classes discussed her death and what it represented about Victorian treatment of children. A charity was founded in her name to support neglected and abused children. Museums began displaying information about her at exhibits on Victorian social history. Cordelia Ashworth, who had been entirely forgotten for over a century, became known. Her name was spoken. Her story mattered. And in the church basement, the doll sat peacefully in its box, no longer radiating desperation and hunger, but something altogether different, a quiet contentment. As if finally, after all these long years, she could rest. Father Sullivan eventually removed the locks from the box. He placed Cordelia's doll in a climate-controlled display case in the church's small museum, with a placard telling her story. Visitors came to see her, to learn about her, to leave flowers and written messages expressing sympathy for a child who had died in 1889. Sophie grew up to become a social worker, dedicated to helping traumatized children. She always kept a photo of Cordelia's doll on her office wall, a reminder of how the acknowledgement of suffering, the telling of forgotten stories, could transform even the darkest hauntings into something meaningful. And Margaret continued her work as a historian, writing about forgotten Victorian children, ensuring that their stories would never again disappear into obscurity. She wrote a foreword for Sophie's book, in which she described her experience with Cordelia, not as a haunting, but as an awakening, a reminder that the dead speak to us not through supernatural terror, but through the profound human need to be remembered. The last entry in Margaret's personal journal, written years later, reads, "I've come to understand that Cordelia was never truly haunting me. She was calling to me. In my deepest moments of connection with her, I realized that hauntings aren't about vengeance or possession. They're about the unbearable weight of being forgotten. When we remember the dead, when we tell their stories, when we acknowledge their suffering and their humanity, we give them something far more powerful than any exorcism. We give them immortality." Cordelia Ashworth died in 1889, locked in a dark room, utterly alone, but now her name is known.
Her story is told.
She is remembered, and in that remembrance she finally found peace. Perhaps we all do in the end. The porcelain doll remains in the church museum to this day, smiling that mysterious smile, forever preserved as a testament to a child whose suffering was finally, at last, witnessed and honored. Some say that on quiet evenings, when the church is empty and the light is fading, you can still feel her presence, but it's no longer dark or desperate. It's gentle, almost protective, watching over the other lost souls who come seeking solace in the old stone building. Cordelia Ashworth is home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments.